You stood in line for 40 minutes. You didn't mind. You were already inside the story. But before the line, there was the leaving. It began at home, and it began early. Someone had checked the newspaper, the actual newspaper, the one that came through the door, and found the small column of times printed in type barely large enough to read. 7:15. 9:40. You picked one, and once you picked it, that was the evening. There was no other showing after that. There was no watching it later. If you missed 7:15, you missed it. So, you started getting ready at 6. You put on the coat that was warm rather than the coat that looked good because you knew you would be standing outside. You checked that you had the money folded in a pocket you could reach without taking your gloves off. You looked at the clock more than once. And somewhere in that hour, without anyone saying it, the evening stopped being ordinary. This is the part nobody films. The anticipation had a shape, and the shape was practical. Coats, coins, a bus timetable, the cold air when the front door opened. The excitement lived inside the logistics. Outside, the street was doing what streets did on a winter evening in 1977. Sodium lamps had come on an hour ago and turned everything the color of weak tea. The pavement was wet, or it had been wet, and the light lay on it in long smears. There were more people out than there would be tonight, walking, waiting, going somewhere. Going out required going out. If you took the bus, you stood at the shelter with people you half recognized. If you had a car, it was cold inside it for the first 10 minutes, and the windows fogged and someone wiped a porthole with a sleeve. The heater smelled of dust burning off. The radio was on, and whatever it played, you weren't listening. You were doing the small arithmetic of arrival. Would there be a queue? Would it have started? Would you get in? That worry was real, and it is almost impossible to explain now. There was a genuine chance you would not get in. The cinema had one screen. One screen, one film, one showing at a time. If it was full, and you would come back tomorrow, and tomorrow you would leave at 5:30 instead of 6. Scarcity did something to attention that abundance has never managed. You could see the building from a distance, because it was built to be seen from a distance. Cinemas were designed for the approach. A vertical sign, often with the name running down it. A canopy over the pavement so people could wait out of the rain. And under that canopy, bulbs, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, plain round bulbs in rows, throwing a warm and slightly uneven light down onto the wet ground. Nobody calls that architecture beautiful. It was not built to be beautiful. It was built to say here, from 4 streets away, in the dark, to people who were cold. And it worked. You saw the glow before you saw the building, and something in your chest moved a little, and you walked faster. There is a word for the particular quality of that light. It is not romance, and it is not nostalgia. It is a signal. The bulb said, the thing is happening, it is happening here, and it is happening whether you arrive or not. That last part mattered. The film would begin at 7:15, with or without you. It did not wait. It could not be paused. Its indifference was the whole of its authority. You turned the corner. And you saw the queue. You turned the corner, and you saw the queue. It went along the front of the building, past the doors, past the poster cases, and then it kept going. It turned at the corner of the block and disappeared down a side street you couldn't see the end of. And your first thought was not how wonderful. Your first thought was arithmetic. How many? How fast do they let people in? Will I get in? Then you walked to the end of it, and you joined it, and something changed. Because a queue is a strange thing. From the outside, it is an obstacle. From the inside, it is a room. You are in it now, and the people in front of you are in it, and the people who arrive after you are behind you, and there is an order to things that everyone accepts without discussing it. Nobody appointed anyone. It simply worked. Look at who was standing there. Not one kind of person. That is the detail that gets lost. It was not only teenagers, though there were plenty. There were couples in their 30s who had arranged a babysitter. They were fathers with 2 children and a look of tired responsibility. There were older men on their own, standing slightly apart, hands behind their backs. There were groups of girls who had clearly spent an hour getting ready to stand in the cold. There were students and shift workers who had come straight from work, and one person who had brought a flask. They were dressed for weather, not for photographs. Sheepskin, corduroy, anoraks in colors that have since been quietly retired, knitted hats pulled down, scarves wound twice. The clothes were warm and they were worn, and nobody was performing. And they talked. This is the part that is genuinely gone. You talked to the people around you. Not because you were friendly particularly, but because you were all standing in the cold with nothing else to do, and the same reason for doing it. Somebody would ask if you'd heard whether it was any good. Somebody would say their cousin had seen it twice. Somebody further up the line would turn around and offer an opinion nobody asked for. It was not conversation, exactly. It was the low collective murmur of people who are about to share something. There were no phones. There was nothing to look at. There was nowhere for your attention to go except the street, the cold, and each other. So you stamped your feet. You shifted your weight. You checked the line ahead every few minutes to see if it had moved, and sometimes it had, by 3 people, and that felt like progress. Somebody's breath went up in a cloud under the lights. The pavement was wet, and the marquee bulbs lay on it in long broken lines that shifted when a car went past. 40 minutes is a long time to stand still. Nobody left. And here is what the queue was actually doing, which nobody in it understood at the time. It was advertising. A line of people around a building is the most persuasive thing a cinema can put on display. Cars slowed down to look. People walking past on the other side of the street turned their heads. Somebody who had no plans that evening saw 60 people waiting in the cold and thought, whatever that is, it must be worth it. And they crossed the road and joined the back of the line. In 1977, this stopped being a local phenomenon and became a story. Queues got photographed. Queues got reported. The length of the line became a fact people repeated to each other, and the repeating made the line longer. There was a feedback loop running through the winter streets of every city, and it was made entirely of people standing still in the cold. No one had planned it. It could not have been bought. Then, at some point, the doors ahead of you opened and the previous audience came out. That was its own event. They came out in a wave, blinking, still partly somewhere else. And every person in the queue watched their faces. You could read it, whether it had been good, whether it had been very good. Somebody coming out would catch the eye of somebody waiting and just nod or grin and say nothing, because saying anything would have ruined it. That exchange lasted 2 seconds, and it was the most reliable review anyone ever got. And then the line began to move properly, and you shuffled forward with the whole mass of it, and the canopy came over your head, and the cold stopped, and there was suddenly light and noise, and warm air smelling of butter and old carpet. You were in. The first thing was the temperature. You had been cold for 40 minutes, properly cold, the kind that gets into your hands, and then you stepped through the doors, and the warmth hit you all at once. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was too much, immediately. Coats came open. Hats came off. Somebody's glasses fogged, and they stood there blinking, holding them, waiting. And then the smell. Every cinema in the world smelled the same, and it smelled of 3 things. Popcorn, first, because the machine ran all evening and the oil went into the air. Carpet, second, old wool carpet that had been walked on by thousands of wet shoes and never quite dried. And underneath both of those, cigarettes. People smoked. In the foyer, sometimes in the auditorium, in a haze that you could see in the projector beam later. Nobody thought about it. It was simply the smell of going out. You would know that smell instantly if you walked into it tomorrow. It has been gone for 30 years and it is still in there somewhere. Look down. The carpet had a pattern, and the pattern was loud. Swirls, or diamonds, or something geometric in maroon and gold, colors chosen because they hid stains. Look at the walls, flock wallpaper, or paneling, or mirrors with beveled edges. None of it was tasteful. All of it was trying. Because the lobby had a job. It was the airlock between the street and the story, and it was designed to tell you that you had arrived somewhere better than where you came from. Cinemas were built for people who did not have much. The carpet was there so that for 2 hours you could stand somewhere that felt like more than your front room. Then, the queue inside the queue, the counter. The choice was small, and that mattered. Popcorn, salted or sweet. A drink in a paper cup. Chocolate in a box designed to be opened quietly, and never was. Ice cream at the interval, sold from a tray by someone standing at the front. That was the range. You were not choosing between 40 things. You were choosing between 4, and the choosing took 10 seconds, and then it was done. You paid in coins. You counted them out on a glass counter with a little dish for change. There was no card, no tapping, no screen. If you did not have enough, you had enough for something smaller, and you took that instead. And the ticket. A paper ticket, printed with a number, torn in half by somebody standing at the door. They gave you back the stub. You put it in your pocket without thinking and found it 3 weeks later in a coat you had not worn, and for a second, the whole evening came back. That stub is the reason people remember 1977 and cannot remember most of last year. The evening left a physical object behind. It was small enough to lose and stubborn enough to survive. The people working there wore uniforms. Not costumes, uniforms, a jacket with the cinema's colors, sometimes a hat that nobody enjoyed wearing. They were mostly young. They tore tickets, swept between showings, stood in the aisle with a torch. The job was neither glamorous nor invisible. They were part of the room. And you waited a little longer. Because the auditorium doors were still closed. The previous audience was still inside, or the staff were still clearing, and so you stood in the warm with your popcorn and your coat over your arm, and the noise of 40 conversations went up into a high ceiling and came back down as one sound. You looked at the display cases on the wall. Framed, lit from behind, glass with a little condensation at the bottom corner. You had already decided what you were seeing. You looked anyway. Somebody said, "They're opening." And the doors were pushed back, and the sound changed, and the whole warm crowd began to move. The doors were heavier than you expected. They always were, padded on the inside, sprung, designed to shut behind you and keep the light out. You pushed through into a different climate. Warmer than the foyer. Darker. And quieter in a way that wasn't silence because 400 people were talking, but the room swallowed it. Carpet on the floor, fabric on the walls, and all of it eating sound. That is the first thing you noticed, and the first thing you forgot. Cinemas were built to absorb noise. Everything soft. Everything heavy. You had walked into a padded box the size of a church, and it had been designed that way by someone who understood that sound is the whole trick. Then, which seats? This mattered, and everyone had a theory. Too close, and your neck hurt. Too far back, and you were among the people who talked. The middle, slightly back, that was the good row, and by the time you got in, someone else was usually in it. So you went up the aisle, in the half-dark, scanning, and somebody's knees had to move so you could get past, and you said sorry, and they said it's fine, and you shuffled sideways along the row of strangers with your coat over your arm and your drink held high. 12 people stood up for you. 12 people sat back down. That happened every single time, and nobody thought of it as anything. The seats were not comfortable. Let's be accurate about this. They were sprung, they were narrow, the fabric was worn through on the arms, and the one in front of you was close enough that a tall man would ruin your evening. If you sat in the same seat today, you would complain. You sat down. You put your coat under you or over your knees. You looked at the curtain. Because the curtain was still closed. That's the detail that gets lost. The screen was not visible when you came in. There was a wall of heavy fabric, usually red or gold, with a fold in it that caught the house lights. You had bought a ticket to see something, and it was hidden behind a curtain, and it stayed hidden until the moment it was ready. That is theatre logic, not cinema logic. It came from the buildings themselves, most of which had been designed for a stage. And it did something to the room. It kept the thing you came for out of sight until the last possible second. Meanwhile, the room filled. The sound went up as it filled. Not loud, layered. 400 conversations at low volume make a texture, not a noise, and it rises and settles and rises again. Someone laughed too hard, 3 rows over. Somebody's seat springs complained. Sweet rappers, all ready. A child asking in a whisper that carried when it was going to start. You knew, without checking a clock, roughly how long you had. You could hear it. Then the lights. Not off down. They dimmed in stages, over 8 or 10 seconds, and everyone in the room understood the grammar of it. The first dip meant soon. The second meant now. Conversations didn't stop. They shortened and then thinned, and then 2 people were still finishing a sentence and everybody else had gone quiet, and they noticed and stopped. And in that gap, the second or 2 between the last voice and the first sound from the screen, 400 people were doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Waiting, facing the same direction. Nobody had told them to. Then the curtain moved. It didn't open like a door. It gathered, pulled up and outward from the middle, in folds, unhurried, and the light from the screen came out from behind it a little at a time, widening. It took maybe 6 seconds, and it was, for a lot of people, the best 6 seconds of the week. Nothing had happened yet. That was the point. Everything was still ahead. You settled back. Somebody, 2 rows down, stopped fidgeting. The room went completely still. And then it began, and for 2 hours, nobody could leave. Nobody in that room knew his name. Somewhere above and behind the audience, behind a wall, there was a small hot room with 2 windows in it. And in that room, for the whole length of the film, there was a man. He is the reason the evening worked, and almost nobody who went to the pictures in 1977 could have told you what he did. Start with the film itself, because the object has been forgotten. A feature was not a file. It was between 2 and 3 miles of celluloid, arriving at the cinema in 5 or 6 flat metal cans, each one heavy enough that you carried it with both hands. It came by van. It had been somewhere else last week, and it would be somewhere else next week, and the cans had the marks of that traveling on them. The projectionist's first job was to build it. He would splice the reels together, cutting the leader, joining the segments with tape or cement, checking the frames lined up, and wind the whole thing onto a horizontal platter the size of a table. 2,000 feet at a time. If he got a splice wrong, the film would jump or tear in front of 400 people, and everyone would know. He also had to watch it first. Not for pleasure, for damage. Scratches, torn perforations, a splice from the last cinema that had been done badly. He was the last person who could catch a fault before it became everyone's problem. Then, in the dark, the run itself. The lamp was the dangerous part. A xenon bulb under high pressure, burning at temperatures that would set paper alight from a distance, throwing a beam intense enough that a still frame in front of it would begin to smoke within seconds. That is the whole reason film moves at 24 frames a second and not slower, not for the eye, but because the film would burn if it stopped. The projectionist worked next to that. In a room that got hot enough that the door was usually propped open, listening to the mechanism, because sound is how you know a machine is well. And in the older houses, running 2 projectors, there were the changeovers. A single reel ran about 20 minutes. So a feature was 6 reels. And 6 reels meant 5 moments in the evening where the film had to pass from one machine to the other without anybody noticing. The signal was on the film itself. In the top right corner of the frame, a small circle would appear, for about 1/5 of a second, twice, roughly 7 seconds apart. The first was the warning, start the second projector. The second was the cue, switch, now. Look for them and you'll see them. Nobody ever did. So there he stood, in the heat, watching the corner of a picture he had already seen that afternoon, waiting for a dot the size of a fingernail. First dot, hand to the motor. Second dot, change. If he was half a second late, the audience got a flash of white and a lurch of sound. If he was on time, 400 people watched a 2-hour film and never once suspected it had been assembled in front of them out of 6 separate pieces. The measure of him doing it perfectly is that you have no memory of it happening. That is a strange kind of craft, and it was ordinary. Every cinema in every town had somebody who could do it. It was a trade you learned by standing next to someone who already knew, and it was paid like a trade, not like an art. He did other things you never thought about. He set the sound level for the room and adjusted it if the house was full, because 400 coats absorb more sound than empty seats. He racked the frame if the picture sat wrong. He opened and closed the curtain on cue. He knew, from the sound of the platter, roughly how many minutes were left. And when it ended, he brought the house lights up, not all at once, but over a few seconds, the same grammar as when they went down, so the room came back gradually instead of being snapped out of it. Then he broke the film down again and put it back in the cans, and the van came. There is a reason to tell you this, and it isn't nostalgia for a job. It is that the evening you remember had a person inside it. Not a service, not a platform, not an algorithm deciding what to show you and when. A man in a hot room with 2 machines and a piece of tape, whose skill was invisible when it worked and obvious when it failed. The picture arrived because he made it arrive. And when the lights came up, and you walked out into the cold talking about what you'd seen, he was still up there, breaking it down, ready to do the whole thing again at 9:40. Here is the thing that cannot be reconstructed. 400 people, in the dark, who cannot leave. Not, would not, could not, practically. You had paid. You had come out. The next bus was in 50 minutes. The film would not stop for you and would not be repeated for you, and if you walked out, you would never know what happened. So you stayed, and so did everyone else, and that shared inability was the whole architecture of the evening. Watch what it produced. Somebody laughs first. One person, half a second before anyone else, because they got it first. And that laugh gives everyone else permission, and the room goes up, not politely, but properly, 400 people at once, and it lasts longer than the joke deserves, because people are laughing at the laughing. You cannot do that alone. A person watching the same scene by themselves might exhale through the nose. The joke is not funnier in a crowd, you are simply more available to it. Then, the opposite. Something happens on screen and the room stops. Not quiets, stops. The rustling ends, the sweet rappers end, somebody who was whispering doesn't finish the sentence. 400 people are holding still at the same instant, and you can hear it, because a room full of people being silent sounds different from an empty room. And in that silence, you become aware of the person next to you. A stranger. You have not looked at them once. But you know they are holding still too, and they know it about you, and neither of you will ever mention it. There is no word in English for that. It is not friendship, and it is not intimacy. It is something more common than either, and we have mostly stopped having it. The gasp is the clearest case. When the room gasps, it gasps as one animal. Not 400 separate gasps, a single intake and then a beat of nothing, and then a scattered nervous laugh from a few people who need to break it. That reflex is contagious in a way that has been measured and is still not fully explained. Your body responds to the bodies around you before your mind catches up. 2 hours of that. Being frightened together, relieved together, moved together in a dark room with your coat on your knees. And nobody could pause it. That matters more than it sounds. Every single person in that room was at exactly the same point in the story at exactly the same second. There was no getting ahead. There was no falling behind. If you looked away for 10 seconds, you had lost 10 seconds that everyone else still had. Attention was not a choice you kept making. It was a condition you had entered. Compare that with what attention is now, a thing you defend minute by minute against a device that is also the thing you are watching on. Nothing in that cinema was competing for you. Nothing could. The room had been built deliberately to leave you nowhere else to go. And when it ended, when the last frame went and the lights began to come up, there were 3 or 4 seconds before anybody moved. That gap is worth naming. Nobody stands immediately. The room sits in half light, finishing something. Then, one person reaches for a coat, and that breaks it, and 400 people stand up and become individuals again and start shuffling toward the doors. For 2 hours, they had been a single thing. Now, they were 400 people who needed to get home. The last of it happened in the aisle. You looked at faces on the way out, and you could tell who had loved it, who hadn't, who was still somewhere else. And sometimes, a stranger caught your eye and made a face that meant well, and you made one back, and that was the entire conversation, and it was enough. None of this was designed. That is the part worth sitting with. Nobody built the cinema to produce collective feeling. They built it because one projector could only serve one room, and one room had to hold enough people to pay for the building. The togetherness was a byproduct of a technical limitation. We solved the limitation. Something changed in 1977, and the thing that changed was not on the screen. It was the line outside. Queues at cinemas were not new. A popular picture had always drawn one. But in the summer of that year, in cities across America and then across Europe, the queue stopped being a consequence and became the event. People went to look at it. Local news sent someone to film it. The length of the line got reported the way weather gets reported. And once that happened, the line grew, because a line that is being reported is an advertisement that cannot be bought. Consider what a person saw. They had no plans. They passed a cinema. There were 200 people standing in the street, in the cold, in an orderly line, patiently, for something. Whatever it was, 200 people had decided it was worth an evening. That is a more persuasive argument than any poster ever printed, and nobody had designed it. The feedback loop ran all summer. Longer queue, more attention. More attention, longer queue. People went back a second time and a third, not always because the film demanded it, but because going was now a thing that was happening and they wanted to have been there. The industry noticed, and the industry changed its shape around what it had noticed. Before this, a film was released the way a book is published, a few cities first, then outward, over months, letting word of mouth do the work. A picture might take a year to reach everywhere. If it failed in the first city, it quietly stopped. After this, the logic inverted. Open everywhere at once. Spend the advertising money before anyone has seen it rather than after. Make the first weekend the whole event. Because the first weekend is when the queue exists, and the queue is the advertising. That is the thing that was actually invented in 1977, and it has never been uninvented. Everything about how films reach you today, the simultaneous global release, the countdown, the opening weekend number reported as news, descends from a summer when people stood outside in a line and other people looked at the line. There is something else, and it is easy to miss. For a few years around then, a very large number of people in a country were watching the same thing in the same month. Not most people, but enough that you could assume it. Enough that a stranger at work had probably seen it. Enough that a reference landed. That has a name in the older sense, a common. A shared thing that belongs to nobody and that everybody can stand on. It was thin, and it was commercial, and it was accidental. But it was real. For a while you could walk into a room of people you didn't know and have something you had all felt at roughly the same time, in the dark, sitting still. Try to name the last time that happened. Not the last thing that was popular. Popular is easy, and there is more of it now than ever. The last thing that was simultaneous. That everyone reached at the same moment, without being able to skip ahead or wait a year. The queue did that. Scarcity did that. The single screen, the fixed time, the 3-week run, the impossibility of seeing it later, all of the limitations, working together, produced a thing that abundance cannot produce at all. And here is the honest part. Nobody wanted those limitations. Every one of them was a problem the industry spent the next 40 years solving. More screens, so nobody has to queue. Longer runs, so nobody misses it. Home release, so you can watch it later. Streaming, so you can watch it now. Each fix was correct. Each fix removed a reason to be in that line. By the time the last one landed, the thing the line produced was gone, and it had gone so gradually that there was no year you could point at and say, that was when. Except perhaps this one. Not because it was when the loss began, it wasn't, but because it was the last time the queue was long enough to be worth photographing. Somebody stood in that line in a coat that wasn't warm enough, and they were part of something, and they didn't know it, and neither did anyone else. The doors opened outward, and the cold came in before you got out. That was the first thing. 2 hours of warm dark, and then a set of doors, and then February at 10 o'clock at night. It went straight through the coat you had chosen at 6 because it was warm, rather than because it looked good. You had forgotten you were wearing it. You had forgotten you had a body at all, and now here it was, on a sidewalk, in the cold, blinking. 400 people came out of one building in about 4 minutes. There is no modern equivalent of that. A stadium empties like that, but a stadium is loud. This was different. This was 400 people who had just been somewhere together, arriving back in the world at the same moment, on the same square of concrete, and mostly not saying anything. That silence lasted about half a block. Because the strange thing, and everyone who was there remembers this, is that nobody talked right away. You would think they would. 2 hours of shared experience, and the first thing you would want is to compare notes. But it didn't work like that. People came out and put on their gloves and looked at the ground and walked, and for 30 or 40 seconds, the loudest sound was shoes. Then somebody would say something stupid. Somebody always did. A brother, a friend, the guy behind you, some deliberately dumb remark, and it broke the surface, and after that, everybody talked at once. And what they said was not analysis. It was not what a review is. It was the part with the car. It was, did you see her face? It was one person insisting on something that had definitely not happened, and 3 people correcting him, and nobody able to prove it, because there was no way to check. You could not go back and look. The film was gone. It existed now only in 400 slightly different memories, walking away in 400 directions, and every one of them was already wrong in some small way. And that did not matter at all. Behind you, the lights came up in the lobby, and somebody started sweeping. And then the bulbs under the canopy went off, not one by one, all at once. A switch somewhere, and the street got darker and older, and went back to being a street. The building that had said here from 4 blocks away had nothing more to say. It had done its work at 7:15, and it was finished with you. The parking lot emptied slowly, because everyone left at the same time, and there was one exit. That was fine. Nobody was in a hurry. Inside the car, it was cold again, colder than at the start of the evening, and the windows fogged from the talking, and somebody wiped a porthole with a sleeve, and the heater smelled of dust burning off. If you took the bus, you stood at the shelter with people you half recognized. The same shelter, the same tube of fluorescent light, the same wet bench, and now you had something in common that you hadn't had at 6 o'clock, and you still didn't speak, because that was not how it worked. But you knew. You could tell who had been in that room by how they were standing. And here is the part that has no replacement. You went home, and you hung the coat over the back of the chair, and you did not do anything else about the film. You did not look it up. You did not find out what the ending meant. You did not read 6 people explaining the ending, and you did not watch the part with the car again, and you did not discover that the thing you thought was brilliant was actually a well-known device with a name. The film just stayed there, in you, unchecked, for days. It came back at odd moments. Tuesday afternoon, out of nowhere, a shot you had not thought about. You carried it around at work, and you were slightly different because of it, and the only way to talk about it was to find another person who had also been there, which meant waiting, and running into them, and saying, "Did you see it?" and watching their face change. That was Afterglow. Not the evening. The week after the evening. It faded. Of course it faded. That is what Afterglow does. And by the following month, you would have swapped most of it for one more look at the part with the car. But it faded slowly, at the speed a memory fades, and while it lasted it was entirely yours, and nothing could add to it, and nothing could take it away. 2 weeks later, the film left town. It went somewhere else, to some other single screen, and if you had not gone on the 7th of February, you had not gone at all. You had the memory. That was the whole of what you got. And for a long time, nobody thought to ask whether that was enough. Let's be honest about what was wrong with it. You couldn't choose. One screen, one film, and if you didn't like it, that was your evening. You stood outside in the cold for 40 minutes, and sometimes the film was bad, and you had already paid, and you sat there anyway because leaving would have been worse than staying. You missed things. If it came and went in 3 weeks, and you were busy those 3 weeks, you missed it, not for a while, but possibly forever. There was no later. People talked about films you would never see, and you nodded along. You couldn't pause. If you needed the toilet, you lost 4 minutes of the story, and nobody was going to explain them to you. If a child cried through the third act, that was the third act you got. If the projectionist was careless, you watched somebody else's fingerprints in the corner of the frame for 2 hours. And it was expensive for what it was. An evening out for a family cost real money in a decade when money was tight. So no, it was not better. Almost everything about it has been improved. You can watch anything now, at any hour, from a chair you already own. The picture is sharper than anything that ever came out of that projector. You can stop it, restart it, turn on subtitles, look up the actor, and finish it 3 days later. Nobody has to stand outside in the rain. Nobody misses anything, ever again. That is not nothing. That is one of the quiet triumphs of the last 50 years, and anyone who pretends otherwise is being sentimental. And still, something went, and it went so gradually that there was never an evening when anybody noticed it going. What went was the requirement. You had to be somewhere, at a time, with other people. And once you were there, you couldn't leave, and neither could they. That was not a feature anybody designed. It was a limitation of the technology, and it produced something that nobody knew how to build on purpose. Because when 400 people cannot leave a dark room for 2 hours, something happens to them. They laugh at the same moment. They go quiet at the same moment. A person you have never met and will never meet again gasps 2 rows behind you, and you feel it in your own chest, and for a second, the two of you are the same animal. You cannot manufacture that. You can only fail to prevent it. We prevented it. Not deliberately, we just made everything easier, and easier turned out to mean alone. The screen came home, and then it came into the room with you, and then it came into your hand. Every step was an improvement. Every step also removed one more reason to be in a room with strangers. And the choosing. 40 minutes in the cold was a price, and prices do something to attention. You had decided. You had paid. You were going to watch this, and you were going to watch all of it, because you had already spent the evening on it. Now there is no price, so there is no deciding. You scroll. You start 4 things and finish none of them. The abundance that was supposed to free you turns out to cost something after all, and what it costs is the thing that friction used to buy, the willingness to sit still and let something take its time. There is more of everything now, and more is not always better. The films didn't go. Most of them are still there, cleaner than they ever looked in 1977, waiting for you in a list. You could watch one tonight. What went was the room. The queue around the corner. The person beside you who had also been standing in the cold. The moment when the lights went down and 400 strangers stopped talking at once, and for 2 hours, without anyone arranging it, you were not alone. You cannot buy a ticket for that. It isn't sold anymore. But it happened. It really happened, And it happened to you, and the fact that it can't be bought is exactly what made it worth standing outside for.